Settle in and let your breathing slow, the kind of slow that makes the room feel larger. Outside, you can almost hear the ocean, steady and indifferent, polishing the shoreline, one quiet wave at a time. In your mind, you're standing on a beach in Adelaide, early light on the water, cool wind on your face. A man sits against a seawall like he's simply resting, well-dressed, shoes clean, expression calm, no wallet, no identification, no obvious panic, just stillness, arranged a little too neatly. Tonight, with a sleepless detective beside you, you'll follow the gentle trail he left behind. Pockets with missing labels, a scrap of words, a book that doesn't want to explain itself, and other unsolved nights that hum softly in the dark. You take a few slow steps closer, and you let your eyes do the boring work first. The kind of work that solves most cases, when it ever does. Not instinct, not drama, just noticing what is there and what isn't. The man is sitting back against the seawall at Somerton Beach, near Glenelg, in Adelaide. It is early December, late 1940s. Summer is arriving in the southern hemisphere, but the air off the water still has that sharpness that wakes you up. The sand is cool underfoot. The sea is steady. The city behind you is still rubbing sleep from its eyes. Two people saw him the night before. Just a figure leaned back, legs out, like he had decided the beach was as good a place as any to rest. One witness thought he lifted an arm slowly, like he was swatting at a mosquito or waving off the world. Another witness thought he was just drunk or tired or both. Nobody called for help because nothing looked urgent. Congratulations, you have now met one of the most reliable forces in true crime. Human beings ignoring something strange because it is quiet. By morning, he is still there. And now, close up. He is too still. His head rests against the wall at an angle that looks comfortable only if you stop imagining muscles. His face is calm, not peaceful exactly, more like someone who has finished a thought and put it away. You look for the obvious first. Blood, bruising, a torn shirt, signs of a fight in the sand. You do not get any of that. You get a man dressed as if he meant to be seen in town, not washed up near the water. He wears a suit, not a beach suit obviously, a proper jacket and trousers, a shirt, a tie, polished shoes that do not belong in sand. There is something almost tidy about him, like he is trying to leave a good impression, like he thinks manners will still matter, even now. And there is the first wrong note. No wallet, no identification, no hat, even though men of that era wore hats the way people later carried house keys. That absence is not proof of anything, but it is a question with sharp edges. Because when a person dies in public, their identity usually shows up fast. A license, a letter, a receipt, a name written somewhere, even carelessly. Here, you have none of that. Just a body on a clean morning, on a public beach, with the ocean pretending it does not care. You wait with him for the next part, the part that always arrives. Police, a stretcher, a doctor with a tired face, the slow, routine turning of a person into a case file. When the medical examination begins, you watch the process with the dull patience of paperwork. People think forensics is bright lights and genius deductions, but most of it is a series of small observations, spoken softly, written down, and filed away. The man is thought to be around middle age. His build is solid, his hands are clean, and his fingernails look trimmed. He does not look like someone sleeping rough. His clothes are not cheap, and they are not torn. There is no sand ground into his knees, no abrasion on his palms, nothing that says he fell hard. And then there is the medical detail that always sounds cold until you translate it into human. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles after death. It gives you a rough idea of time, not a perfect one. Nothing in death is as neat as television wants. Heat, cold, body size, illness, all of it changes the schedule, but it gives you a window. The thinking is that he died sometime in the early morning hours, before the beach was busy, before anyone would get close enough to see that his stillness was permanent. No one finds a weapon. No one finds a note. No one finds an obvious reason. The body is not screaming the answer. It is doing something worse. It is keeping its mouth shut. You stand at the edge of that silence, and you try the simplest question again. Who was he, and why was he here? That question follows you off the beach and into the rooms where answers are supposed to live. A police station that smells like old paper, ink, and tired wool coats. A mortuary that smells like disinfectant trying and failing to argue with reality. The problem with a nameless death is that it drags everything down into basics. You cannot call his family. You cannot check his job. You cannot ask his friends if this is normal behavior. You cannot build a timeline with ordinary anchors, like a train ticket or a workplace clock-in. So you begin with the objects on him, because objects are often more honest than people. And that is where you start to notice the small, ordinary details that should not be missing. You go through his pockets the way you go through your own, looking for something familiar, something boring. Coins, a receipt, a ticket stub, a folded letter, a cheap pen, anything that says, I exist in the world and I buy things. He has things, but not the ones you want. There is a comb, the kind of plain comb that says he cared about his hair, but not enough to buy something fancy. There are cigarettes, a pack that is not quite right because the cigarettes inside are of a different brand than the pack itself. It is a small detail that feels like a shrug. Maybe he ran out and borrowed. Maybe he mixed them on purpose. Maybe it means nothing. In unsolved cases, maybe is the default setting. There are matches. There are small bits of paper. There are tickets, including a bus ticket and a train ticket. Ordinary, almost reassuring. The kind of items that suggest he was moving through the city like anyone else. Not hiding, not fleeing, not acting like a cornered animal. And yet, the labels in his clothes have been removed. Not one, several. From the jacket, from the trousers. Cleanly cut away as if someone took careful time with a blade and did not want to leave ragged fabric behind. That is not something people do by accident. It is effort, and effort usually has a reason. You can imagine innocent explanations if you try. Maybe he bought secondhand clothing and removed a name tag. Maybe he disliked itchy labels. Maybe he was a sailor used to marking gear. But the neatness of it nags at you. The steady decision implied by the scissors. If a person wants to be identified, they do not usually erase their own trail. They drop it everywhere without thinking. They leave a store receipt in a pocket. They keep a letter. They forget a business card. They keep a key with a recognizable shape. Here, the trail has been edited. It is the kind of editing that does not feel like panic. It feels like planning. A person making choices in advance when they still had time. That is what makes it uncomfortable, because it pushes you toward two possibilities, and neither is gentle. Either he wanted to disappear, or someone wanted him to stay unknown. The police, back then, do what police do. They take fingerprints. They photograph him. They send descriptions out. They check missing persons. They ask other jurisdictions. They wait for someone somewhere to recognize a face and claim it. In the 1940s, that process is slower. No databases humming in a server room. No instant cross-checks. Mostly paper, phone calls, and human memory. It is the investigative equivalent of trying to find a song stuck in your head, except the song is a dead man and the radio station is every police department in the country. Days pass, then weeks, and no one comes forward. That absence changes the atmosphere of the case. At first, it is just an unidentified body. Sad, but not rare. Then it becomes something else. A man in a good suit, with his labels removed, dying quietly on a public beach, and nobody seems to be missing him loudly enough to reach the police. You do not have to be dramatic to find that strange. You just have to be awake. You keep going through the inventory because that is all you can do. Every small item becomes a possible lever. The train ticket, for example. A ticket that suggests he traveled, or meant to. It is a kind of breadcrumb. It tells you he was in the city, moving through the ordinary systems of transport. He was not a ghost. He stood at a counter. He paid money. He interacted with someone, briefly, even if nobody remembers his face. And that is the boring truth detectives live in. Most crimes do not hinge on a genius clue. They hinge on mundane systems, buses, shops, keys, laundry marks, cheap pens, and the hope that the mundane will betray the person who thought they were being clever. But here, the mundane is stubborn. It offers you routine without identity, motion without a name. The clothing, too, keeps giving you that same feeling. A suit that looks tailored, or at least fitted well. Shoes that are clean, the kind of presentation that suggests pride, or habit, or a life where you show up looking decent because you cannot afford not to. He is not dressed like someone who intended to die on a beach. Most people who choose that, if they choose it, do not pick their best outfit. They do not polish their shoes and sit down like they are waiting for a bus. Unless they wanted to be found looking like this. Unless the presentation is part of the message. That is the thing about deliberate tidiness. It can be dignity or it can be staging. And before you can decide which, you have to do the next grim step. You have to listen to what the body can tell you about how it stopped. The post-mortem is not glamorous. It is careful, clinical, and deeply human in the way it reduces all stories to flesh and timing. The doctors look for disease, for injury, for poison, for any clear mechanical failure that explains why a man would die upright, leaning back as if he simply ran out of energy. The findings are, frustratingly, not clear. There are signs that could suggest poisoning, but nothing that points neatly to one known substance. There is congestion in organs. There is something like internal distress, but nothing that says, "Here is your answer, wrapped in a bow." Poison is always seductive in unsolved stories. It sounds clever. It sounds like espionage and shadows and whispered motives. But poison in real life is usually more pathetic. It is domestic. It is accidental. It is someone misreading a label. It is an overdose of something ordinary. When it is murder, it is often chosen because the killer cannot stand the mess of a blade or the noise of a gun. If this man was poisoned, you have to ask who had access and when. On a beach, late at night. That is difficult. If he was poisoned earlier, you have to map his last hours, and you do not have a map. So you sit with the uncomfortable options, because that is what the job becomes. Illness is possible. A sudden heart event, an undiagnosed condition. It happens. People die quietly in public, more often than anyone wants to think. But the lack of identification pulls against that. A person with a normal life, even a lonely one, leaves traces. Accident is possible. Something ingested, something taken. But again, he is dressed like he had a plan. Self-harm is possible. The beach is calm, and calm places attract desperate decisions. But the scene does not carry the usual signs. No container nearby. No note in an obvious place. No scattered personal effects. No frantic gesture. And then, discreet harm done by someone else. Not a struggle, not a loud argument, just a quiet end, delivered earlier, with the beach chosen as a stage. Uncertainty does not scream. It hums in the background. It follows you home. It sits at the edge of your bed, tapping a file folder softly, like a polite ghost. To keep working, you do what investigators always do when the big answer will not come. You go smaller. You pick at details. You look again at those cigarettes. Wrong brand in the wrong pack. A small mismatch. It could mean he accepted cigarettes from someone else. It could mean he rolled his own and reused a pack. It could mean he was the kind of person who saved things. Or it could mean nothing at all, and you will waste 3 days on it anyway. Congratulations, you have discovered the emotional economy of detective work. Time spent, hope spent, and no refund. You consider where he might have been before the beach. The train ticket suggests movement. There are reports about luggage left in a station, a suitcase that may belong to him, containing clothes and personal items that also have labels removed. That kind of consistency matters. If it is his suitcase, then he was committed to the label removal. He was not just wearing borrowed clothes. In that suitcase, there are small, dull hints of a life. Clothing, a shaving kit, things that suggest travel, but still no solid name. The kind of belongings that could belong to any man moving from city to city, doing work that does not require introductions. Some items in the luggage lead to more questions. A tie with a particular type, thread that suggests repairs, a sense of someone who maintained his things. It paints a picture, but it is a soft picture, like charcoal smudged by a thumb. A man who cared about presentation. A man who traveled. A man who erased labels. A man who died quietly. You try to anchor the timeline. The last sightings on the beach. The night before. The body found in the morning. The likely window of death. The train station, the luggage, the possible arrival time. The trouble is, that you can build a timeline out of guesses, but it will never hold weight in court or in history. And in the middle of all that, one more detail waits in the folds of the story. Not in a pocket you checked, not in the obvious inventory. It is the kind of detail that hides patiently until someone turns the fabric just right. Later, as the examination continues, a small torn scrap of paper is found concealed in the man's clothing, tucked away, hidden, like someone did not want it to fall out by chance. That is when the case changes its temperature. Because paper is different from objects. Paper carries language. Paper carries intention. A comb just exists. A ticket just proves you paid. But a message, even a small one, implies a mind reaching out. The scrap is tiny. The letters are printed, not handwritten. And the words, once they are read, are simple and strange. Tamám Shud. It is not English. It does not match the setting, the beach, the suit, the city. It looks like a clue from the wrong puzzle box. The phrase is Persian. It can mean ended, or finished, or concluded. The kind of words you might see at the end of a book. The last line, the closing of a story. It is final, but it is not flashy. It is not a melodramatic suicide note. It is not an accusation. It is just a quiet stamp, like someone closing a ledger. And that is what makes it so effective. As a piece of mystery, it does not explain itself. It does not even try. You follow the simplest thread, because that is all you can do. Where did this scrap come from? And who put it there? Police begin looking for the source, because if it is torn from a book, then somewhere there is a book with a matching tear. That is not romance. That is mechanics. Paper fibers match, edges match. The way a tear pulls creates a kind of fingerprint, especially if you have both parts. So you imagine the book, some copy, passed from hand to hand, sitting on a shelf, on a bedside table, in a car, in a library. You imagine someone tearing out the final words, folding them small, and hiding them in clothing. Not dropping it like trash, not leaving it in a wallet, concealing it. The act feels deliberate. Again, that same quiet planning. It would be easy, at this point, to lean into the glamorous idea. Secret agents, Cold War games, a man with no name, dying with foreign words hidden on his person. It is a good story, too good, but the truth, more often, is that mysteries are made from ordinary human habits. People carry poems in their pockets. People keep scraps of books because a line meant something to them. People do strange things when they are grieving, or ashamed, or in love. And sometimes, yes, people do strange things because they are involved in work that requires secrecy. But you do not get to pick which explanation is true. You have to earn it. And the Somerton Man never makes it easy. The investigation starts combing for the missing book. They ask around, they check cars, they check lost property, they do the unglamorous rounds. And then, in a very ordinary way, the case offers you another object, one that feels like it drifted in on the tide of coincidence. A man comes forward with a book he found in his car. Or rather, a book that appeared there, left behind in the back seat sometime around the period of the death. It is a copy of a collection of poetry, commonly known as the Rubaiyat. It is not an obscure book. It exists in many editions. It is the kind of thing someone might own without being a spy or a philosopher, but the timing matters. And the final words in many versions of that book include the phrase, Tamám Shud, finished. You can feel the click of it, the way two pieces of a puzzle finally touch. Not enough to show the whole picture, but enough to prove the puzzle is real. If the scrap was torn from this book, then this book is connected to the man. If it was his book, then perhaps he carried it, read it, and tore the words out himself. If someone else tore it out and placed it on him, then that someone else had access to his body, or to his clothing, or to him in his last hours. Either way, you are no longer just looking at a nameless body on a beach. You are looking at a story that includes literature, intention, and the stubborn human habit of leaving symbols behind. And when you open the book, you find something else. Not a confession, not a clear instruction, just more quiet strangeness. Inside, there are markings. A few lines of letters, written in a way that does not immediately resolve into a sentence. There is the suggestion of a code, or the suggestion of someone jotting down shorthand that only made sense to them. The kind of notes you write when you do not want anyone else to understand, or when you assume no one else will ever look. That is the unsettling part, really. How easily meaning slips away when context is gone. A living person can look at a scribble and remember the whole day it came from. A dead person leaves you the scribble, and you can spend decades arguing about whether it is a cipher or just boredom. You look at the marks and you try to keep your feet on the ground. Codes exist, people do use them, but people also write down nonsense. They write down phone numbers without names. They write down fragments of thoughts. They invent little systems for themselves. You stare at the letters, and you imagine two different worlds. In one, the letters are a real cipher, something structured, something with a key, something that could reveal names, plans, locations, the kind of thing that makes an investigator's pulse quicken, even if they pretend it does not. In the other world, the letters are not a code at all. They are just the detritus of a mind, a man passing time, writing initials, abbreviations, reminders, the kind of marks that are deeply personal and completely useless once the person is gone. Both worlds lead to the same outcome. You still do not have his name, but you do have a new path. Because books, unlike bodies, often have histories. They are bought somewhere. They are printed in editions. They have misprints, stamp marks, paper qualities. They can be traced, sometimes, like a slow-moving fingerprint. And if there is a phone number written in the book, or an address, or a clue disguised as a casual note, then the next step is not poetry. The next step is people, living people with memories that do not always behave. And once you start looking for the missing book's path through the city, you realize something simple. Adelaide is full of quiet places where objects change hands, without witnesses, without paperwork, without anyone thinking it matters. So you start with the kind of lead that feels almost embarrassing in its simplicity. A phone number. It is written in that copy of the Rubaiyat, tucked among the odd marks and half-meanings. You look at it the way you look at a stain on a shirt you just ironed. Small, inconvenient, and suddenly important. You do not know who wrote it. You do not know when. You do not know if it belongs to the dead man or to whoever handled the book before him. But it is something the city can answer, if the city feels like cooperating. So you do what detectives always do. In every decade, you call it. or you knock on the door that number points to, and when the door opens, the mystery stops being made of paper and starts being made of people. The number leads to a woman in Adelaide, a nurse, a person with a job that teaches you to keep your face calm when your stomach turns, someone who has seen suffering up close and learned the quiet skill of not making it about herself. Years later, people will say her name like it is a plot twist, like a woman answering a phone is the same as a confession. It is not. It is just a human link, thin as thread, but real. You stand there with the dull authority of a badge and a question you cannot soften. Do you recognize this man? And this is where the story gets foggy. In that way, stories do when memory becomes evidence. Some accounts say she looks at the plaster cast of his face, or a photograph, and something flickers across her expression. Something like shock. Something like recognition that she tries to swallow quickly. Congratulations! You have arrived at the part of an unsolved case where everyone argues about a look. A look is not a fingerprint. A look is not a signature. A look is not a time-stamped receipt. A look is just a human face reacting to a human problem. And when people retell it, they paint the look in whatever color they prefer. Still, you cannot ignore it, because even the possibility of recognition is more than you have had for weeks. A nameless dead man does not often come with someone who might have known him. The nurse, when asked, does not give you a neat answer. She does not say, yes, that is him. Here is his name. Here is where he lived. She does not collapse into tears and reveal a secret marriage. Life does not usually give you that kind of theater. Instead, there is distance, evasion, maybe, or privacy, if you want to be kind about it. She says she does not know him, or she cannot identify him, or she offers something small, a suggestion, a half-memory, a name that is not quite a name. There is a man she once knew, perhaps, a man she may have met during the war years, a man she might have given a copy of the Rubaiyat, because it is the sort of book people give when they want to sound thoughtful, romantic even. And now, decades later, that book has washed back into her life like a piece of driftwood. Carrying a phone number that leads straight to her door, you try not to force it, because forcing it creates the kind of false certainty that ruins investigations. You ask, gently, about her past, about whether she ever knew someone from interstate, about whether she ever wrote her number in a book for someone. And she stays careful. People in her position learn to stay careful. Nurses know what happens when you give too much of yourself away. The world starts asking for more. There is also the matter of her child, a son in some tellings. A boy who grows into a man, while this case sits in files and newspaper clippings. Over time, people look at photographs and start doing what people always do. They start looking for resemblance. The jawline, the ears, the shape of the mouth, the kind of comparisons that feel persuasive late at night when you want the story to connect. But resemblance is cheap. You can find it anywhere if you are hungry enough. Half the world shares a chin with someone else, and the more famous a mystery becomes, the more you can mistake your desire for a solution as evidence. Still, you note it. You do not marry it. You set it down on the table with everything else. The nurse becomes a softly closed door in the story, not locked, not slammed, just closed, with a polite finality. She does not give you the neat human anchor you want, and that leaves you in a familiar place, a case with one foot in the physical world and the other foot stepping into mist. You keep working anyway, because that is what you do when the exciting leads fail. You go back to the boring ones. You follow the paper trail. You look at transportation. You look at clothing. You look at that suitcase again. And you ask the kinds of questions that do not make headlines. Who altered these clothes? Who could remove labels that cleanly? Was it done by the wearer? Over time? As a habit? Or was it done in one sitting as an act of erasure? You examine the stitching and the repairs. Clothing in that era often carried little maker marks. Dry cleaners used coded threads. Tailors left patterns of work that experienced eyes could read like handwriting. In a perfect world, you find a tailor who remembers the man's measurements. In a perfect world, you find a laundry worker who recognizes a coded stitch. In a perfect world, the suitcase tag leads to a clerk who says, yes, he checked it in at 7:15. But you do not get a perfect world. You get the long middle, the part where the investigation becomes a slow grind through offices and phone calls, and every person you speak to is tired of being asked. You also get the public, and the public, when faced with a mystery, does what it always does. It fills the silence with stories. Tips come in. Some are sincere. Some are nonsense. Some are people trying to touch fame with their fingertips. Some are people who truly believe they saw him somewhere, sometime, on a tram, on a street corner, in a bar. You learn the specific pain of unsolved cases, the way they attract certainty, like a porch light attracts moths. People want to be the one who knows. People want to be the one who solves it from their armchair. And sometimes, once in a while, the armchair person is right. But most of the time, they are just adding another layer of dust. So you do what you can. You triage. You separate the possible from the theatrical. Missing persons reports are compared. Photos are mailed. Fingerprints are checked against available records. Back then, that process is limited. If his prints are not on file, the system cannot magically invent a match. It is like trying to unlock a door with a key ring that does not include the key you need. Military records are considered because his dress and bearing suggest discipline. Merchant seaman records come up because sailors move and sailors disappear, and sailors often have reasons not to be traced. But nothing clicks hard enough. You circle back to the idea of poisoning because it explains the lack of struggle. A man can be poisoned and still sit down like he is simply tired. A man can be poisoned and still look composed, right up until his body decides it is done. But the lack of a clear toxin keeps the theory from landing. Testing in that era is not what it becomes later. Some substances are hard to detect. Some break down fast. Some mimic natural causes in the body. And that uncertainty becomes a kind of invitation. If you cannot prove poison, you cannot rule it out. And if you cannot rule it out, you can build any story you like. Espionage becomes the obvious one because it flatters everyone involved. It flatters the victim because it makes him important. It flatters the investigators because it makes them players in a global chess game. It flatters the audience because it makes them feel like they are peeking behind a curtain. But real espionage, if it exists here, would be quieter than the rumors. It would be paperwork and casual meetings and boring travel. It would look like a man buying a ticket and checking a suitcase. It would look exactly like the life you cannot reconstruct. You try to keep your cynicism useful. You do not dismiss the spy angle because stranger things have happened. But you also do not let it become a substitute for evidence, because evidence is what you can touch. A body, a scrap of paper, a book, a suitcase, a timeline that refuses to stay still. The case becomes famous not because it is bloody. It becomes famous because it is tidy. A death placed gently into the world with a message that sounds like the closing line of a poem. Finished. But nothing is finished, not for you. Not for anyone who has to carry the file from one shelf to another. Years pass. The file grows heavier. The paper yellows. People retire. Witnesses die. The beach stays a beach, busy in summer, empty on cold mornings. The sea doing what it always does, smoothing sharp edges until everything looks natural. And in the long middle, the case keeps changing shape because the world changes around it. Techniques improve. Fingerprints become easier to compare across jurisdictions. Databases begin to exist. Later still, DNA becomes the kind of magic word people throw around, like it is an incantation, as if science can resurrect a name from a bone. But even science has to eat what it is given. If evidence is lost, contaminated, mishandled, or buried in bureaucratic decisions, science cannot rewind time. Science cannot unspill coffee on a report. Science cannot stop a box from being mislabeled. And that is the unglamorous truth you keep tripping over. Justice is not just about catching someone. It is about keeping the right items in the right condition long enough for the future to become useful. So, you watch the file move through decades like a tired traveler. You watch new investigators take their turn, each one quietly convinced they will be the one to crack it. They start where you started: the body, the clothes, the missing labels, the scrap, the book, the phone number, the nurse, the suitcase, and every time it slips away again, like trying to hold smoke. At some point, you learn to respect the possibility that there may not be a grand answer. That the Somerton Man may not be a spy, he may not be a villain, he may not be a tragic romantic hero, he may simply be a man who did not want to be found. Or a man who could not be found because the people who would have claimed him were gone, or ashamed, or far away. People vanish quietly, more often than you want to admit. Sometimes they do it on purpose. Sometimes they do it because nobody is looking. Sometimes a life collapses into loneliness, and there is no one left who would recognize their face on a beach. That is the boring truth that sits under the poetry. A mystery does not require a mastermind. It only requires a gap, and human beings are full of gaps. But you also cannot ignore the deliberate pieces, the labels removed, the scrap hidden, the strange marks in the book, the phone number, the possible emotional reaction of a nurse who did not want to talk. Deliberate is a word you learn to fear. Deliberate means choice, and choice implies motive. So you keep the file open, even when it feels silly, even when it feels like you are chasing a ghost through paperwork. And as the decades stretch on, there are moments when the case flares back into public attention. A new theory, a new analysis, someone claiming they solved the code. Someone else claiming the code is meaningless. You see, people treat the letters in the book like a sacred text. They apply cryptography. They look for patterns. They run frequency analysis. They try keys and ciphers and wartime code systems. Sometimes they get excited because a pattern almost forms a word, almost forms a sentence. But almost is not a confession. Almost is not a map. Almost is just another kind of disappointment. There is also the matter of the scrap, Tamám Shud, a phrase that becomes iconic because it is so clean. You learn that some versions of the Rubaiyat use that phrase at the end. Others do not. Editions vary. Printings vary. The physical paper matters. So you trace the book itself as best you can, where it was printed, how rare that particular edition might be, how it could have ended up in a car in Adelaide, how the torn scrap could match its final page. And you remember the humiliating truth of objects? They travel in dumb ways. Someone leaves a book behind. Someone borrows it and forgets. Someone finds it and tosses it on a back seat. It ends up where it should not, without drama. Meaning is something humans pour into the cracks afterward. The nurse remains one of the only human faces in the story that you can almost touch. She is not a silhouette on a beach. She is not a guess in a file. She is a person with a door and a number and a job and a life she does not want turned into a public exhibit. So you treat her like a person, even if the world does not. If she knew him, she had reasons to keep it quiet. Reasons can be romantic. Reasons can be shameful. Reasons can be protective. In that era, a woman could lose more than her peace of mind by being linked to the wrong man, at the wrong time, under the wrong rumors. If she did not know him, then her number in the book is just one of those cruel coincidences that keeps investigators awake, a random connection that looks like fate. Either way, it does not solve the death. It only makes the death feel closer. Eventually, you reach a point where the case becomes a kind of cultural artifact. People talk about it the way they talk about old ghost stories. They add flourishes. They repeat the same details until they harden into myth. And this is where you, the weary investigator, get annoyed in a very quiet way. Because myth does not help. Myth entertains. Myth sells newspapers. Myth gives the public a story with a shape. But myth is a liar. A charming liar, but still a liar. So you keep returning to the facts, because facts are all you have. A man found dead on Somerton Beach, well dressed, no identification, clothing labels removed. A scrap of paper reading Tamám Shud, a copy of the Rubaiyat linked to that scrap, strange markings in the book, a phone number leading to a nurse, a suitcase possibly linked containing more label removal and travel hints. Everything else is inference. Everything else is hope. And hope is not evidence. Hope is just what keeps you from throwing the file in the bin. Now, you sit in the long middle of the investigation, where progress is measured in millimeters. You watch the system do what the system does, which is to keep working even when nobody is watching. Reports are typed, photographs are filed, evidence is boxed, the case is revisited, then set down again. And because the Somerton Man refuses to give you a clean ending, your mind starts to wander. the way it does at 3 in the morning when the office is quiet and the coffee is cold, you start thinking about other cases like this, other nameless bodies, other edited lives, other mysteries built not from violence, but from absence. Because once you have seen one person turned into an unknown, you start noticing how easily it happens. A missing name is contagious. It makes you look for more. And one night, with rain tapping against the window like impatient fingers, you find yourself pulling a different file. Not because it is connected, because the feeling is the same. A woman in a cold forest, a life reduced to fragments, labels cut out, names missing, a story that looks like it was edited on purpose. You turn the page, and the air in your mind shifts from salt to pine, from a warm Australian coastline to the sharp, wet cold of Norway. You are walking on uneven ground, the kind that makes your ankle complain. The trees are thin and tall, and the sky hangs low like a lid. The smell is damp earth and moss, and something faintly chemical that you cannot place at first. It is late autumn, in the early 1970s, near Bergen. The locals call the valley Isdalen, Ice Valley, a name that does not promise comfort. You are not here for a scenic hike. You are here because someone found a body where bodies are not supposed to be. She is lying among rocks, partly hidden, as if the landscape tried to cover her out of embarrassment. There are signs of burning, not the clean kind you get from an accident, but the uneven, ugly kind that suggests intention or panic. You crouch, careful, because the ground is slick and because your mind is already building a list. Clothing, items, any scrap that says who she is, any boring little thing like a name tag or a receipt. But the boring little things are missing again. Her labels are cut out like the Somerton Man's. The same gesture, the same quiet erasure. Not proof of connection, just proof that humans share certain instincts when they want to vanish. Around her, you find objects that feel staged. A bottle, pills, pieces of a life laid out like props, but without the script. And once more, you are staring at a person whose name is not available for purchase. They call her the Isdal woman, because when you do not have a name, you get a label that matches the place you were found. It is a cold kind of naming, practical and lazy. You search her pockets, her bag, the surrounding area. You find no passport on her body, no wallet that helps. The small personal items she has are like the Somerton Man's routine without anchor. But then the investigation finds something that changes the rhythm. Luggage. She had luggage stored elsewhere in a train station locker. And inside, the story begins to assemble itself, not as a biography, but as a travel itinerary. There are wigs. There are sunglasses. There are different currencies. There are postcards. There are clothes. There are items with labels removed. There is also the faint smell of cosmetics and fabric, and that stale metallic scent luggage gets when it has been shut too long. You can almost hear the locker door clanging open, the sound echoing down a station corridor. The police start tracing her movements through hotels, because hotels keep records, even when people lie on the forms. And this woman, whoever she is, seems to have stayed in multiple hotels under different names. She checks in, she checks out, she moves on. She is seen with suitcases, sometimes well-dressed, sometimes trying not to be memorable. Witnesses describe her as poised, reserved, maybe foreign. They remember her because she stands out and also because she tries not to. That is a particular skill. To be noticeable and forgettable at the same time, like a smell that fades the moment you name it. The hotel forms show aliases, different birth dates, different addresses, a life made of masks that are just convincing enough to get a key. You can picture her handwriting, steady, practiced, the way she would slide the form back across the counter with a polite smile. And you can picture the clerk, bored, thinking only about the next guest, because that is how people slip through cracks, not by being invisible, by being ordinary enough that no one bothers to look twice. The investigation tries to reconstruct her route. Bergen, Stavanger, Oslo, maybe more. She travels by train. She buys tickets. She eats meals. She exists in public. And yet, nobody knows her name. There are witness statements that make the story feel darker. Some hotel staff recall her asking for a room change, insisting on a balcony, or being particular about the view. Some recall strange odors in her room, like chemicals. Some recall her removing labels from clothing or burning papers. And again, you have to be careful, because once a case becomes mysterious, every memory grows sharper, not because it is true, but because people want to be helpful. The police also find notes coded in a way that looks like shorthand, not identical to the Somerton Man's marks, but familiar in spirit, little clusters of letters and numbers that could be travel logs or encryption. To you, it reads like someone tracking appointments, cities, dates, movements. If you want to be dramatic, you call it spycraft. If you want to be honest, you call it a person trying to keep their life organized without leaving a readable trail. And both can be true. Dramatic and honest can share a bed even if they do not like each other. They do an autopsy because bodies speak when people refuse. They find a mixture of pills in her system. Sleeping tablets, possibly? The kind that quiets the nervous system and makes the world feel far away. The kind that can kill depending on dose. There are also signs consistent with smoke inhalation from the burning. The details are debated over the years, as they often are, but the shape is clear. She died alone in a remote place with fire involved, and with an identity that had been deliberately blurred. Was it suicide? Was it murder? Was it an accident during an attempt to destroy evidence? You sit with the same uncomfortable options you sat with on Somerton Beach. A person can choose to die. A person can be made to die. A person can die while trying to do something else. And the truth does not always announce itself. For a while, the investigation in Norway pursues the espionage theory hard. The Cold War is not a metaphor then. It is a daily pressure. Norway has sensitive military installations, NATO activity, strategic coastlines. A woman traveling under multiple names looks like a problem someone in an office would underline in red. There are reports of her being seen near naval facilities, reports of her watching, listening, blending in. But reports are not convictions. Reports are just people noticing a pattern after the fact. The police create composites. They circulate descriptions. They check international missing persons. But she remains a blank spot. Years later, technology brings new attempts. Isotopic testing of teeth, for example, which can sometimes suggest where a person grew up. based on the chemistry of water and food. It is not magic, it is probability with a lab coat. The results point tentatively toward parts of Europe, perhaps Central or Eastern. But even that is debated because science gives you ranges, not addresses. And again, you feel that familiar frustration. The world is full of tools, but tools cannot replace a name written down somewhere by someone who cared. The Isdal woman becomes another story the public carries, another unsolved night that hums softly under the noise of daily life. And because you are you keep comparing the texture of it to Somerton. Labels removed, travel, calm presentation, a depth that feels staged, or at least curated, the possibility of poisons, the flirtation with espionage. But you also see the differences. Somerton is a man who dies in plain sight in a public place, dressed to be found. Isdal is a woman who dies in a hidden valley, burned, reduced, made difficult. One feels like a closing line of poetry. The other feels like an attempted erasure. And yet, both end the same way. A file folder with unknown on the front. A person transformed into an object of speculation. You learn something from that pattern if you let yourself. Identity is not a permanent state. It is a network. Family, friends, paperwork, habits. Someone who will call you if you do not show up. When that network is cut, identity collapses fast. The world does not keep your name alive out of kindness. It keeps it alive because it is written down, repeated, attached to transactions. Take away the transactions. Take away the labels. Take away the friends. And you can become a mystery in a matter of days. And in the long hours when you cannot sleep, you find yourself thinking of places, not just people, because some mysteries are not about who. They are about how a place can turn on you, how an ordinary home can become a locked room, even without locks. A farm, quiet enough that you can hear footsteps in snow. Germany, early 1920s. Rural, isolated, the kind of place where days are built from chores and news arrives late if it arrives at all. You stand at the edge of a property called Hinterkaifeck, and even the name sounds like something you should not say too loudly. The wind is thin and cold. The fields are sleeping. The buildings huddle together as if they are trying to conserve warmth. You smell hay and manure and wood smoke, the honest smells of a working farm. But underneath that, there is another smell, faint but wrong. The smell of something left too long. Neighbors have noticed something off. The family has not been seen. The routine has broken. No smoke from the chimney, no one at church, no one doing the small social chores that keep rural communities stitched together. You walk up the path with other villagers, and you feel that old dread settle into your shoulders. The dread of doors that should open but do not. When you enter, the house is quiet in a way that feels staged. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty home, the tense quiet of a place that has stopped suddenly. The family is gone, but not gone. You find them not all at once, because the scene is not kind enough for that. There are signs of violence, but also signs of routine continuing strangely. Animals cared for, food present, a sense that whoever did this may have lingered. It is one of the details that makes Hinterkaifeck feel like a fever dream. The idea that after the murders, Someone stayed on the farm, fed the livestock, moved through the spaces like they belonged there. You look at footprints, in snow sometimes, footprints that come from the forest toward the house and do not clearly go back. You look at the attic because there were reports of noises up there before the murders. Footsteps, movement. The family suspected someone was in the house or near it. Imagine that, late at night, you are in a rural home. The walls are thin. The wind makes its own noises, sure, but then you hear something else. Measured steps above your head. You tell yourself it is the house settling. Congratulations. So did the killer. The victims are found in a barn, in some accounts, lured or taken one by one. The weapon is blunt, brutal, intimate. Not a gunshot from a distance. The kind of violence that requires proximity, strength, and a willingness to feel what you are doing. The case becomes infamous, not just for the murders, but for the atmosphere. The sense of someone nearby, the sense of a predator not rushing but waiting. Investigators, such as they are in that era and place, do what they can. They interview neighbors, they look for motives, money, grudges, inheritance, and scandal, of course, is never far in small communities. People talk about the family, their relationships, rumors of abuse, rumors of conflict, rumors of someone watching the property. But rumors are like smoke. They tell you there is fire somewhere, but they do not tell you whose match lit it. Evidence handling in that time is a polite way of saying chaos. Crime scenes are not preserved the way they are later. Villagers walk through, people touch things. The dead are found by neighbors, and neighbors are human. Humans react, they disturb, they try to make sense by doing. So the scene becomes compromised almost immediately. Footprints are overwritten. Objects are moved. The narrative is contaminated. And you, in your modern mind, watching this unfold, want to scream. Not because screaming helps, but because you can see the future. The decades of speculation built on a foundation that was trampled the first day. The killer is never definitively identified. Suspects come and go. Names are whispered. Some are accused more loudly than others. But the case stays unsolved, hanging over the farm like a low cloud. And when you think about it, next to Somerton and Isdal, you notice the shared thread again. Not labels this time, not code. Something simpler. Silence. In Somerton, silence is a man dying without explanation. In Isdal, silence is a woman traveling under false names. In Hinterkaifeck, silence is rural isolation and a community full of secrets it will not fully confess. Silence is what lets mysteries survive, and that brings you back, reluctantly, to the most boring truth in all of this. Most cases are not solved by brilliance. They are solved by someone talking, eventually. Someone who saw something and finally admits it. Someone who kept a secret and gets tired. Someone who cannot carry it anymore. But when nobody talks, or when everyone who could talk is dead, you are left with what you can measure. You are left with bones, paper, and the stubborn indifference of time. So, you keep your mind in that mode, the mode of looking at small details and waiting for them to matter. Back at Somerton, the file keeps evolving, long after the original investigators are gone. It is handed down like an unwanted heirloom. New eyes, new tools, same old questions. At some point, interest renews around the body itself. Because bodies, unlike witnesses, do not change their story. They only become harder to read. There are photographs, there are preserved samples, there is the possibility, decades later, of extracting genetic material. But even that is not straightforward. Old evidence is fragile. Preservation methods were not designed for future DNA extraction. Handling was not sterile by modern standards. If you are lucky, you get enough to build a profile. If you are unlucky, you get contamination and disappointment, and the public waits, as it always does, for science to arrive like a hero. Science is not a hero. Science is a patient clerk with a microscope doing paperwork in a different language. When DNA work becomes possible, it does not instantly hand you a name. It hands you relationships. It hands you probabilities. It hands you a family tree full of strangers. And then you still have to do the detective work, the dull human work of matching records, tracing lines, finding where a person could have fallen off the map. There is a temptation in that moment to treat the mystery like a game, to treat the dead like a puzzle box. You resist that because you have been in enough rooms with enough grief to know better. A nameless body is not entertainment for the people who loved them. Even if those people are gone now, even if those people never existed in the way you imagine, the truth remains. Someone lived in that suit. Someone combed their hair. Someone held that book at some point. Someone made choices, and the choices are what keep you awake. Because if the Somerton Man chose to erase himself, then why? If someone else erased him, then who? You revisit the nurse again in your mind because she is still the closest thing to a human hinge in the case. If she was linked to him romantically, then the scrap of poetry makes emotional sense. The Rubaiyat is full of longing and fatalism. It is the kind of book that gets pressed into someone's hands like a private message. Tamám Shud, ended, finished. It could be the final punctuation mark of a personal tragedy. If she was linked through something else, something professional or clandestine, then the same objects take on a different tone. The book becomes a carrier. The phone number becomes a contact. But you cannot pick which story you prefer. You have to live with the uncertainty because that is what the evidence demands. And the evidence stubbornly remains incomplete. That is why these cases linger, not because they are violent, but because they are unfinished in a way that feels personal. They force you to imagine the missing parts. They invite you to participate. You, standing in the evidence room at night, will always try to complete the pattern. Your brain hates gaps. It will fill them with whatever is nearby. So you develop a habit. You keep returning to the physical facts. You keep anchoring yourself. The bus ticket, the train ticket, the suitcase at the station, the carefully removed labels, the cigarettes in the wrong pack, the scrap hidden in clothing, the book left in a car, the numbers written inside, the nurse behind the door, the quiet refusal to explain. That is the case, stripped of myth, and when you sit with it long enough, you notice something else that feels almost too simple to mention. The Somerton Man was found in a public place, which means the city moved around him for hours while he was dying or already dead. People walked past. Couples sat nearby. Someone saw him move his arm and decided it was none of their business. That is not villainy. That is normal life. People do not want to be wrong about emergencies. People do not want to be the one who overreacts. People do not want to touch a stranger's story. So they keep walking. And sometimes that is all it takes for a death to become a legend. A few ordinary decisions to look away. You let that sit, because it is not just Somerton. It is every case. It is every missing person poster that stays up too long until it becomes part of the scenery. Which is why, when your mind drifts again, it drifts toward another kind of disappearance. Not a body on a beach, not a burned identity in a valley, not a farm turned silent. Something more modern feeling, something built out of a last phone call, a note, a routine broken. The kind of mystery that starts with a person who is simply not there, and the only thing left behind is a small piece of communication that can be interpreted 100 ways. You picture the basic elements because you have seen them before. A kitchen table with a single chair pulled out slightly, a cup in the sink that was never washed, a coat missing from the hook, a toothbrush still damp, a phone that goes to voicemail, a family member calling again and again, trying to keep their voice calm, and then the police asking the first questions they always ask, because the first questions are not poetic, they are procedural. When were they last seen? What were they wearing? Do they have a history of leaving? Any mental health concerns? Any debts? Any relationships that recently went sour? It is always the same list, because human beings are always the same animal under stress. The difference, in these cases, is the note. Sometimes it is a letter, sometimes it is a text message. Sometimes it is a voicemail that sounds normal until you listen a second time and hear the strain under the words. The note is never as helpful as people want it to be. It rarely says, "I am here, and this is why." It usually says something like, "I need space," or "I will be back soon," or "Do not worry. Congratulations. You have just been handed the most dangerous phrase in missing person investigations. Do not worry," because worry is the appropriate response when routine breaks. Worry is the alarm system, and the note, if it exists, is often the thing that delays action just long enough for the trail to cool. You start thinking about how time behaves in disappearances. In murders, time is measured in lividity and body temperature. In disappearances, time is measured in missed appointments and unanswered calls. It is softer, but it is just as brutal. If someone vanishes voluntarily, the first 48 hours are still critical because people make mistakes. They use bank cards. They call someone. They turn on a phone. If someone vanishes involuntarily, the first 48 hours are even worse because evidence is being lost with every passing minute. Footprints fade. CCTV footage overwrites. And yet, families are often told to wait, to give it time. Adults have a right to leave. That is true legally. But reality does not care about legal truths. Reality cares about momentum. And once momentum is gone, you are pushing a dead car uphill. So in these modern mysteries, you watch the same cycle happen. A person disappears. The family insists it is not normal. The police ask about mental health, relationships, voluntary absence. The first search is organized. The second is smaller. Then the case becomes a file, and the file becomes a number. The public might help. Posters, social media, tips. But tips are a strange ecosystem. The louder the story gets, the more people think they recognize the missing person everywhere. A sighting at a gas station, a sighting at a bus depot, a sighting in another state. Most are wrong, some are malicious, a few are sincere and useless, and the missing person remains missing. This is the gentle unfinished, the mystery built out of silence rather than spectacle. No blood in the headlines, no dramatic ransom note, just an absence that grows heavier with time. You reflect, because you cannot help it, on how quickly a life becomes unknown in official language. One day, a person is a whole set of habits. They like their coffee a certain way. They fold their laundry. They complain about the weather. They exist in 1,000 tiny moments. Then they vanish, and the world reduces them to descriptors: height, weight, hair color, last seen wearing. And that reduction is necessary for search efforts, but it is also cruel in a quiet way. It takes the person and turns them into data. It is the same cruelty you see in Somerton and Isdal. Unknown male, unknown female, unidentified remains. In all these cases, the system does what it can with what it has. But what it has is never enough, because the system cannot measure love. It cannot measure regret. It cannot measure the moment someone decided to leave, or the moment someone was forced. So you sit with that truth as the night stretches on, not as a moral lesson, but as a procedural reality. Unsolved does not always mean complex. Sometimes it means delayed. Sometimes it means the wrong officer got the case on the wrong week. Sometimes it means evidence was mishandled. Sometimes it means the person who knew the key fact kept quiet for 20 years. And sometimes it means the missing person simply never intersected with a system that could identify them again. You think of Somerton again, 'cause you always do. A man dies in a suit, on a beach. A scrap of poetry says finished. A book points to a phone number. A nurse closes the door. The case becomes a legend. But legends are made of ordinary parts. A ticket, a comb, a missing label, a decision not to call for help when a stranger looks like he is sleeping. And if you let yourself, you can almost hear the ocean again behind all the paperwork and theories. The steady, indifferent sound that does not care whether you solve anything. You are not going back to the beach yet. Not fully. There is still too much file left open. Too many details in the long middle to sift through. The kind of details that do not sparkle, but sometimes matter. For example, the suitcase at the station. If it truly belonged to the Somerton Man, it suggests he arrived with intention. He did not just wander onto the sand by accident. He had belongings. He had plans, or at least the structure of a plan. And in those belongings, investigators found more small oddities, items that seemed out of place, thread that matched repairs, clothing choices that suggested he was not local or was trying not to look local. Some accounts mention an orange-colored substance on his skin, possibly linked to cosmetics or to decomposition. Some mention his calves being unusually developed, like a dancer or someone who did a lot of walking in certain shoes. These details become their own little branches of speculation. Was he a sailor? A dancer? A laborer? A man who walked long distances? You learn to be cautious with physical inference. Bodies adapt in many ways. A hobby can shape you as much as a job. Genetics can mimic training, and once a detail becomes famous, it becomes exaggerated. Still, you keep it on the list. You also revisit the missing wallet, because absence can be a clue too. If he had been robbed, you might expect signs of disturbance. Pockets turned out, clothes rumpled. But the scene is too composed. If he had lost his wallet earlier, you might expect him to have other identification tucked somewhere. People in that era often carried something: a letter, a card, a membership slip, unless he did not want to be identified, unless the wallet was removed deliberately by someone who knew what it meant. The labels removed tell you the same thing. This is not a spontaneous disappearance. It is sustained. And sustained effort suggests either long-term intent or a lifestyle where anonymity is normal. So you look at occupations where men travel and do not leave many traces. Merchant mariners, itinerant laborers, salesmen, military men moving between postings, men estranged from families. You also consider the sadder category: men who are alone, men who have burned bridges, men who no longer have anyone to report them missing. It is an option that feels too bleak for a mystery story, which is exactly why it might be true. But then you come back to the scrap. Tamám Shud, not just erased identity, but a symbolic gesture. A man alone might still carry a scrap of poetry. A man preparing to die might choose a phrase that feels like a final sigh, ended. It is possible the simplest explanation is the right one. A man decided to end his life, and to end his identity with it, to vanish cleanly, without dragging anyone else into it. But the uncertainty remains, because the medical evidence did not confirm suicide neatly, because the poison was not identified, because the case does not resolve into a single mundane cause. So you stay in the long middle, where you are always balancing plausible explanations like weights in your hands. And while you do that, the world keeps producing more mysteries, more unidentified bodies, more disappearances, each one with its own quiet hooks. Which is why your mind keeps drifting between them, not to sensationalize, but because pattern recognition is the only comfort you get in this work. You begin to notice that the most haunting cases are not the loud ones. They are the ones with restraint, the ones that feel like someone tried to tidy up the truth. Somerton feels tidy. Isdal feels curated. Hinterkaifeck feels like someone lingered in the aftermath, comfortable enough to feed animals. In each, there is a sense of control, and control is always the question. Who had it? When did they have it? And what did they do with it? You keep that question close as you continue turning over the Somerton file in your hands, not looking for a dramatic twist, just waiting for the next small detail that refuses to fit. That detail, when it finally shows itself, is usually not glamorous. It is administrative. It is the kind of thing that lives on a form, in a drawer, under a rubber stamp. You start thinking about all the ways a person can be mislabeled, not metaphorically, but literally. A clerk writes the wrong time. A suitcase tag is copied wrong. A witness points at the wrong man in a lineup of bad photographs. A file gets refiled, one folder left, one shelf too far to the left. Congratulations, you have just met the real villain of most investigations. Paperwork that does not care what you meant. So you take the Somerton Man back down to the plainest question you can ask at this stage. What do you actually have, and what can be tested without imagination? You have clothing with labels removed, you have items from pockets, you have the book, you have the suitcase, if the chain of custody holds. You have medical observations that suggest something went wrong inside him. Fast. You have a city that did not notice him until it was too late. And you have one more quiet category of evidence people forget about. The stuff inside the seams. In that era, men's clothing often carried little private signatures. Tailors made small marks. Dry cleaners used coded stitching, a few colored threads, or a knot in a certain place. It is not romantic. It is the laundry version of writing your name on a lunch bag. Investigators did look for that. They looked for the kind of stitching that says, "This jacket passed through this shop in this neighborhood." If you find the shop, you find a customer list. If you find the customer list, you find a name. In theory. In practice, you get the reality check. Shops close, records burn, owners retire. And even if you find the shop, you meet the oldest enemy in the building. Nobody remembers. A man in a suit is not memorable, not unless he makes trouble, not unless he tips badly, not unless he bleeds on the carpet. He is just another collar and tie moving through a day. So the laundry trail, like most trails in this case, has just enough scent to make you lean forward, and not enough to catch. Your mind keeps circling the labels, because removing one label could be comfort. Removing all of them starts looking like intention. Labels tell you where something was made. They tell you the store, the brand, sometimes even the batch. They turn a jacket into a route, manufacturer to retailer to buyer. Cut them out, and you turn a route into fog. That same fog hangs over his suitcase contents. Not empty, not sparse, just careful. Clothes? Basic items. The kind of things you pack when you plan to stay somewhere briefly. And the more you think about it, the more you realize how odd it is that he traveled with so little that was personal. No letters with his name, no photographs, no address book, no little object that exists only because a person once loved him. It is possible he was simply private. It is also possible he was managing his risk, and risk management in ordinary life is not always spies. Sometimes it is debt. Sometimes it is a second life, one that cannot survive contact with the first. You let that thought sit in the corner without feeding it, because you do not have proof. You have a dead man in a good suit and a city that cannot place him. And then you remember the thing that does not fit the tidy suicide theory, the hidden scrap. If he wanted to send a message, he could have left it in his pocket like a normal person. He could have placed the book beside him. He could have written a note on hotel stationery, the way desperate people often do. But this scrap was tucked away the way you hide a key you do not want to lose. That suggests two very different moods. Either he wanted the scrap found, but not by accident, or he did not want it found at all, and it was discovered only because someone went through him with methodical hands. Neither option is comforting. You also think about the way he was positioned, not sprawled, not collapsed forward, sitting back, legs out, one arm resting. The posture makes you imagine a few final minutes that were slow. A man who had time to arrange himself. A man who felt unwell and decided to sit. A man who was waiting and simply stopped waiting. If poison was involved, it would have had to act without drama. No frantic thrashing, no loud vomiting on the sand where everyone would notice. The kind of poison people imagine in thrillers, neat, efficient, nearly invisible. But poisons that behave neatly are not common. Most real poisonings look miserable. They look human. They look like someone losing control of their body in a way that cannot be staged into dignity. That contradiction keeps your attention locked on the medical details, even when you do not like it. Congestion, abnormalities, a lack of a single obvious cause, and you remind yourself of the boring limitation of the time. Testing was narrower. Some substances were difficult to detect. Some could be metabolized quickly. Some plant-based toxins were known more in rumor than in lab protocols. You can have a real poisoning and still end up with a report that reads like a shrug. So you are stuck again in that exhausted place where everything is possible and nothing is provable, which is how the Somerton Man becomes what he becomes. A file that invites new eras to take their shot. Decades later, new investigators and researchers come back with newer tools. And the most obvious tool, the one people say like it is a miracle, is genetic genealogy. Not because it is mystical, because it is just math applied to family trees. If you can get a usable DNA profile, you can compare it to databases of living people who have submitted their DNA. You are not looking for the man exactly. You are looking for his relatives, third cousins, second cousins once removed, distant branches of a family that does not even know it has a missing limb. Then you build backwards. You draw the tree. You cross-reference births, deaths, marriages, migrations. You look for the right age, the right sex, the right absence from records, and sometimes, if you are patient and lucky, the unknown person stops being unknown. But even here, the case is not clean. There were long arguments about exhumation, about access, about whether disturbing remains was justified. There were worries about contamination, about sample quality, about whether decades of handling had erased the genetic signal. And there is always the reality check. DNA does not tell you the story of why. It tells you who someone likely was and who they were related to. It does not tell you how they ended up on a beach with poetry in their pocket. It is a name, not an explanation. The Somerton Man case, in the real world, has had developments in recent years, with researchers proposing an identification through genetic genealogy. Many people now believe he was a man named Carl, sometimes spelled with a K, known as Carl Webb. The proposed identification points toward a family in Melbourne, with a life that could plausibly lead to Adelaide. The match is not just vibes. It is built from genetic links and records, the dull machinery of ancestry. But even if you accept that identification, you do not get to close the file with a satisfying click, because now you have a new set of questions. If he was Carl Webb, why were the labels removed? Why was there no identification? Why the scrap? Why the book? Why the careful emptiness of his pockets? Why the quiet death in a public place? A name is a door. Sometimes, behind it, there is only another hallway. You sit with that. A lot of people think solving a mystery means the moment you speak the right name aloud. They imagine the music swelling. They imagine credits rolling. But you know better. In real investigations, the name is where the work starts getting awkward. Now you have to look at the person's life, their relationships, their finances, their health, their habits, their secrets. And you have to do it without the original witnesses, because time did what it always does. It took them. You try to picture him in a normal day, not as a symbol on a beach, but as a man with groceries, a man who owned socks and got bored and had to decide what to do with his afternoons. The case mythology makes him larger than life. The probable identification makes him smaller and, in a way, sadder. Because if he was a relatively ordinary man, then the case is not an international chess game. It is a personal collapse that left no confession. And personal collapses are the hardest to prove because they happen in private. You keep looking for that one detail that refuses to fit, and in this newer frame, the deliberate editing. Labels do not remove themselves. Scraps do not hide themselves. Someone did those things, or he did. If he did, then he was preparing to be unknown. That is not a crime. It is just a decision that leaves everyone else holding the consequences. And that is the most quietly brutal part of these cases. The dead person is beyond discomfort. The living are the ones sentenced to uncertainty. You let the Somerton file sit open on the desk, and you allow your thoughts to drift back to the other mysteries you pulled for comparison. Because patterns matter even when they do not prove anything. With the Isdal woman, the pattern is the same kind of editing, but louder in effort. Multiple aliases, wigs, currencies, hotel moves, a trail designed to look like a trail and still not reveal the walker? If you have ever tried to cancel a subscription online, you understand the principle. The steps are there, technically. You can follow them, but the design is meant to exhaust you before you reach the end. That is what an alias life does to investigators. It makes every step possible and every conclusion slippery. And yet, the Isdal woman case has had its own modern push too. Isotope analysis, dental examination, witness re-interviews, reconstructed timelines. You follow the hotel registers the way you would follow receipts. After a messy night, not glamorous, just stubborn, you match dates and locations. You look at handwriting, you look at the way she filled out forms, the choice of letters, the spacing. You look for consistency, because consistency is where the mask slips. Then you get to the objects. Wigs are not just disguises, they are purchases. They come from shops. Shops have owners. Owners have memories. Sunglasses have brands. Brands have distributors. Luggage has manufacturing traces. It becomes a kind of scavenger hunt through capitalism. The world is built out of transactions, and transactions leave paper. But paper, again, is only as useful as the people who kept it. You consider the pills found in her system. Sleeping tablets are common, and that is what makes them useful for both suicide and staging. In real life, people use them to turn down anxiety, to force sleep, to blur edges. A person can accumulate them legally. A person can also gather them over time, a little at a time, from different doctors. If you are trying to disappear, you learn quickly which systems are strict and which are tired. The burning complicates everything. Fire destroys evidence, and it also creates its own false signals. Heat changes tissues. Smoke changes lungs. Burns can cover injuries. You can set a fire to a race. You can also set a fire because you are panicking and doing something dumb. Criminals do dumb things constantly. They are not evil geniuses. They are just people trying to outrun consequences with whatever idea arrives first. And when you stare at the Isdal woman case long enough, you notice the same thing you noticed at Somerton: the tension between planning and mess. Her life looked planned. Her death looked messy. That could suggest suicide after a long period of careful movement. It could suggest murder that needed to look like suicide. It could suggest an accident during an attempt to destroy evidence. Every option is ugly in a different way. And then your mind inevitably drifts back to Hinterkaifeck, where planning and mess sit together in the most domestic way possible. That farm case is older, and it suffers from an older problem. The scene was not treated like a scene. People walked through it like a story they were entitled to enter. You think about the footprints again, the reports of tracks leading from the forest to the house with no clear tracks going back. It is the kind of detail that feels supernatural, but is usually just weather, timing, and human error. Snow falls, snow melts, wind blows, footprints soften. Then villagers arrive and make their own. You end up with a narrative that sounds like the killer vanished into thin air, when really, the evidence vanished into boots. The idea that someone stayed after the murders, feeding animals, is the detail that refuses to leave your mind, because it suggests familiarity. It suggests a killer who knew the routines well enough to continue them. That points to someone local, someone who did not fear being interrupted. It is possible the killer was hiding on the property even before the murders. Those reported attic noises, the sense of being watched, the tiny domestic dread of hearing a floorboard complain when everyone is supposed to be asleep. If you have never experienced that particular fear, you can still imagine it easily. You are in bed. The house is quiet. Then you hear a sound that does not belong to the house's normal language. A pause. Another soft step. You tell yourself it is the building settling. But buildings do not usually settle in a pattern, and the family did report odd things: missing keys, strange footprints, tools out of place. But in rural life, odd things are often filed under. Life is hard and weird until they can no longer be ignored. By the time a threat becomes undeniable, it is often already inside the walls. The investigation of Hinterkaifeck produced suspects, but no conclusion. And the reasons for that are not mysterious. Evidence degraded, witnesses contradicted, motives were tangled with rumor, authorities were limited. The case became a community wound that never scabbed over, because a scab would require a story everyone agreed on. So when you lay these cases side by side, late at night, you see how different they are and how the same mechanism keeps them alive. Not violence, not gore, not even cleverness. It is the absence of a satisfying narrative. Your brain hates a story without a reason. It will keep chewing it the way a loose tooth keeps pulling your tongue back to it. Which brings you gently into that last modern feeling category you started describing. The disappearance that begins with a small message. Not poetry in a pocket, not aliases in a hotel, just a note that says something like, "I need time." There are a lot of cases like that, too many to count. And you do not need one specific name to understand the procedure, because the procedure is always the same. Tired machine. A person is last seen at a normal time in a normal place. A neighbor sees their car. A coworker expects them. A family member gets a text that seems ordinary. Then, the next expected contact fails. The phone rings without answer. The routine breaks. That is the moment the family starts making bargains with reality. Maybe they lost their phone. Maybe they fell asleep. Maybe they needed a break. Maybe they are angry. Maybe they will call tomorrow. And those maybes, while emotionally understandable, are how hours disappear. Police respond within rules. Adults can leave voluntarily. You cannot force someone to be missing. You can only report the absence and request help. The first response depends on circumstances, vulnerability, known risks. If there is evidence of danger, you get urgency. If there is not, you often get that word again, wait. In the meantime, life continues doing what life does. People go to work. It rains. Roads fill with traffic. And all of it erases small traces. Security cameras overwrite footage after a set period. Some keep days, some weeks. If you do not ask in time, the images are gone. Cell tower data exists, but it requires legal process. Bank transactions can show movement, but if someone is using cash, you are blind. And if the person wanted to vanish, they know these systems better than you think. Not because they are criminal masterminds, because everyone learns, casually, what modern systems track. You know your bank app shows purchases instantly. You know your phone shares location if you let it. You know your car's navigation remembers addresses. So if you wanted to disappear, the first thing you would do is not dramatic. You would simply stop being convenient. You would leave your phone behind, or you would turn it off. You would avoid your cards. You would travel in the boring ways that leave fewer records. You would not tell anyone the truth. And if someone else made you disappear, those same behaviors can be forced onto the scene to simulate choice. A phone left at home, a wallet staged, a note written to buy time. Notes are tricky. People treat them as pure truth because writing feels deliberate. But writing can be forged, coerced, or composed under pressure. Even genuine notes are rarely precise. People in distress do not write like clerks. They write like humans. They are vague. They circle feelings. They avoid hard facts. That vagueness is what turns a note into a Rorschach test. The family reads it and sees a cry for help. A skeptic reads it and sees a planned exit. An investigator reads it and sees time lost. Because time lost is what notes reliably create. You can be a good person and still be delayed by a note. You can be a careful investigator and still have to treat it as a possible indication of voluntary absence. And while everyone is trying to interpret tone, the world keeps spinning, grinding away at the trail. When the search begins, it often starts with the most immediate geography, the last known location, the routes between home and work, nearby parks, trails, water, friends' houses, relatives, hospitals, jails. You learn quickly that missing persons work is not like homicide work. In homicide, you have an event. In missing persons, You have a gap. You are searching for where the gap began to widen, and the gap can widen anywhere. A person can stop at a gas station, meet someone, decide something, be taken somewhere, or simply keep driving. The world offers 1,000 exits. If there is a vehicle, you look for it first. Cars are easier to spot than people. Cars have plates. Cars need fuel. Cars can be found abandoned. If there is no vehicle, you look for digital footprints, calls, messages, social media logins. But those can be absent too, either because the person is careful or because the person cannot use them. Witnesses are the next layer, and witnesses are always imperfect. Someone at a store might remember serving them, but not remember the time. A neighbor might remember seeing them, but confuse days. A coworker might misremember a last conversation because memory is influenced by what happens afterward. That is why investigators love the boring things. Receipts, camera footage, transaction logs. Data does not get embarrassed. It does not try to be helpful. It just sits there and tells you what happened, if it still exists. But even data has a shelf life. Footage overwrites. Logs are deleted. Devices are lost. So you end up, again, with the same tired ingredients as the older mysteries. A person reduced to fragments and everyone else trying to rebuild them from the fragments that remain. It is not as poetic as Tamám Shud, but it is the same mechanism, a missing label, a missing moment where someone should have said, "This is wrong." And at the center of it is the plainest truth you keep returning to. Most mysteries are not solved by brilliance. They are solved by persistence and timing, and one human being deciding to speak honestly. Sometimes a case breaks because a friend finally admits there was an argument. Sometimes it breaks because a spouse finally admits there was an affair. Sometimes it breaks because a stranger comes forward with a small sighting they were afraid to mention. Sometimes it breaks because someone commits a different crime later and their habits match. Sometimes it breaks because a body is found by accident years later in a place nobody thought to look. And sometimes it breaks because science gets a second chance, because someone preserved a sample, filed a report correctly, or resisted the temptation to throw old evidence away. You think about that, and your mind drifts back again to the Somerton Man, because in his case, the stubborn facts did survive. The body was documented. The artifacts were kept. The story remained accessible enough for new methods to reach back through time. That is not guaranteed. Most cases do not get that luxury. So you consider, with quiet respect, the unglamorous chain that kept his mystery alive long enough to be revisited. A mortuary technician labeling samples, a police clerk filing photographs, someone, somewhere, deciding not to discard an old box because the shelf was crowded. It is not heroism. It is just someone doing their job. And that, ironically, may be the closest thing to justice you can promise in these stories. Not a dramatic resolution, but the continued existence of evidence. Because evidence is patience made physical. And as you continue moving through the modern disappearance framework, you keep noticing how quickly evidence becomes not evidence. A missing person's home gets cleaned. because the family cannot stand the mess. Laundry gets done, beds are made, trash is taken out. Each act is normal, caring, human, and each act quietly destroys tiny pieces of the timeline. A friend drives the missing person's car back from a parking lot to keep it safe. A relative charges their phone. Someone logs into their computer trying to find clues and changes timestamps without meaning to. Congratulations. You have now contaminated your own crime scene. With love, investigators try to manage that, but they arrive after the family has already done what families do. They tried to fix the situation by tidying it, by making it feel survivable. And then the case becomes, again, a slow bureaucratic grind. Forms, flyers, tip lines, case numbers, search grids, coordination with volunteer groups, weather windows, budget constraints, sometimes quiet conflict between agencies. The public sees search parties and imagines momentum. You see the other side? The exhausted planning meetings, the maps on folding tables, the lists of areas already searched, and the constant fear of having missed a ditch. If the person is found alive, everyone exhales, and the details often remain private. If the person is found dead, the case changes category. If the person is never found, the file enters that long middle, the same long middle you have been living in all night. In that long middle, the story becomes a handful of durable facts and a cloud of theories. A last seen time, a last known outfit, a note, if there was one, a ping, if there was one, a sighting, if it was credible, then years of maybe. And this is where your work, as the sleepless investigator, turns into something like custodianship. You keep the facts clean, you keep the timeline straight, you keep the rumors from hardening into truth, because the longer a case goes unsolved, the more people decorate it. They turn a missing person into a character. They decide what kind of person they were. They decide what they would or would not do. They decide whether the note sounded happy or sad. But humans are complicated even on their best days. On their worst days, they can sound calm while panicking or cheerful while planning something final. So you stay skeptical, but not cruel. You remind yourself that a note is a snapshot, not a map. And you notice, again, how these modern disappearances echo the older, unidentified cases. In both, the person becomes a story told by others. In both, the person's own voice is absent, except for whatever small artifacts remain. In Somerton, the artifact is a scrap of a book. In a modern case, it might be a text message. Different medium, same problem. Interpretation without context. If you have ever reread an old message thread and realized you misremembered the tone, you understand why investigators do not like relying on text. Words are flat. They do not carry facial expression. They do not carry the pause before someone hits send. Even handwriting analysis, in older cases, is not a magic key. It can suggest, but rarely confirm. A person can disguise their writing. A person can write with their other hand. A person can be coerced. And then there is the possibility people hate to say out loud. Sometimes the note is not from the missing person at all. It can be staged. It can be dictated. It can be forged in a way that is good enough to buy time. Buying time is the whole point, because time is what investigators need, and what perpetrators want to steal. So you keep circling time. In Somerton, time is the hours between a witness seeing him move his arm and someone realizing he was dead. In Isdal, time is the unknown window when she moved from hotel routines to a valley. In Hinterkaifeck, time is the days the farm sat wrong before neighbors came close enough to see. In modern disappearances, time is the delay between the first missed call and the moment someone decides this is not normal. That decision is often the hinge. And because you are trying to tell the truth in a calm voice, you do not pretend there is a universal rule. Some people are flaky. Some people do leave for a day without telling anyone. Some adults do choose to start over. But routine matters. Personality matters. Context matters. The best investigators are not the ones who assume the worst immediately. They are the ones who recognize when normal behavior has broken. And that is what you keep teaching yourself to look for. The break. In Somerton, the break is a man with no labels. In Isdal, the break is a life of hotel aliases that ends in fire. In Hinterkaifeck, the break is smoke missing from the chimney, chores interrupted. In a modern case, the break is a missed school pickup, a shift not attended, a daily call not made. And once you see the break, you go back and ask what could cause it without romanticizing the answer. Sometimes the cause is mental health crisis. Sometimes it is domestic violence. Sometimes it is opportunistic crime. Sometimes it is an accident, a car in water, a body not found because the landscape keeps secrets. Landscapes are better at hiding than people. Water especially. You think of how many vehicles have been found years later in ponds, canals, reservoirs, simply because the angle of light changed, or a drought lowered the water, or sonar technology became cheaper. The people were missing, and the answer was sitting quietly under a reflective surface the whole time. That is another unglamorous truth. Some mysteries persist because the world is large and cluttered, not because the perpetrator was brilliant, not because the victim was a ghost, because a car sank in a place nobody looked. And that thought about landscapes holding answers brings you back gently to the beach again, because the beach is a landscape that looks open but hides things in plain sight. Sand shifts, tides rewrite the ground, people walk through and erase each other. A body can be visible and still be ignored. Evidence can be present and still be missed, which is why Somerton remains such a strong symbol in your mind. It is not a hidden valley. It is not a locked farmhouse. It is a public shoreline, and still, the man managed to be unknown. So, you take a moment to revisit what the case looks like now, when you strip away the theatrical layer and look at it as an administrative problem. An unidentified man was found. He was documented. Items were collected. A scrap of paper was discovered later. The scrap led to a book. The book led to a phone number. The phone number led to a woman who did not cooperate fully, or could not. The investigation ran out of contemporary leads. Decades later, modern methods likely provided a name. That name, however, did not automatically provide motive or cause. So the case, even with identification, still contains the original mystery. What happened in those last hours? Did he take something voluntarily? Was it administered? Did he die of natural causes that looked odd? Was the scene staged for dignity or staged for deception? You find yourself leaning back in your chair, listening to the soft buzz of old fluorescent lights in an evidence room that exists only in your mind. You think about how investigators actually close cases. Most do not close with certainty. They close with thresholds. Beyond reasonable doubt, probable, possible, inconclusive. Unsolved cases often live forever in inconclusive, not because nobody cares, but because reality does not always produce enough clean edges to cut certainty out of it. And while the public loves an answer, you know that in policing, an answer that cannot be supported is worse than silence. It creates the wrong closure. It lets the real story rot underneath. So you keep your hands off the temptation to declare. You stay with what can be supported and what remains just out of reach. And as you continue to hold these 4 cases together in your mind, you notice how each one teaches the same procedural lesson in a different accent. Somerton teaches you that identity can be erased with simple acts, and that symbolism can distract from basic questions. Isdal teaches you that movement creates records, but records can be filled with lies that still function. Hinterkaifeck teaches you that scenes can be destroyed by curiosity, and that rural silence can be its own accomplice. The modern disappearance teaches you that time is the most fragile evidence of all, and that a single message can buy a perpetrator exactly what they need. None of these are bedtime morals. They are just the mechanics of how mysteries survive. And if you are honest, the thing that keeps you awake is not the gore or the violence, it is the normality. The idea that so much of this happens in ordinary places with ordinary objects while everyone else is busy living. A comb in a pocket, a book in a back seat, a pair of footprints in snow, a note on a kitchen table. Small things, heavy outcomes. You let the weight of that settle without making it dramatic, because drama is easy. Reality is harder and quieter. Then you do what you always do when the file resists. You go back to the tiniest actionable question. In Somerton, that question is still about contact. Who knew him in the days before? Who handed him cigarettes? Who sat with him? Who owned the rubaiyat before it ended up in that car? Who wrote the number inside? Because the only way to turn objects into narrative is to find the hands that held them. And those hands, most of the time, belong to people who never imagined they would matter. A driver who gave a lift, a bartender who served a drink, a clerk who sold a train ticket, a friend who loaned a book. The entire case is built on the hope that one of those ordinary interactions left a trace strong enough to survive. You imagine Adelaide again, not as a mystery setting, but as a living city. Tram lines, ticket booths, men in shirt sleeves, women in summer dresses, the smell of tobacco and sea salt. 1,000 faces passing each other without names. Somewhere in that crowd, the Somerton Man was still alive, still moving, still making choices, and nobody wrote down the moment he stopped being just another stranger. That is the part that never stops being unsettling. How a person can cross the boundary into death without any audience recognizing the scene change. So you keep watching the crowd, in your mind, the way an investigator watches old footage on a loop, looking for the flinch, the hesitation, the moment someone looks over their shoulder. But there is no footage. There is only the reconstruction, built from tickets and time windows. And that is where you find yourself. Now, in the procedural twilight, where stories are made of what is missing, you hold that thought and you let it lead you back into the modern disappearance one more time, because it completes the circle. It shows you how little has changed. You still rely on small objects, you still rely on timelines, you still rely on people who do not want to be involved. The only difference is the type of paper. Now the paper is digital and it evaporates faster than the old kind. A text can be deleted. A phone can be reset. A social media account can be deactivated. A location history can be turned off. A camera can fail. A cloud backup can be inaccessible without a password. You can live an entire modern life that leaves fewer traces than a 1940s man with a bus ticket. And that means the same kind of mystery can happen again, right now, quietly, in a neighborhood that thinks it is safe. Not because evil is everywhere, because systems are imperfect and humans are tired. And some people know how to fall through cracks. So you continue following the procedure, because procedure is the only steady thing you can offer. You start with who last spoke to them. You verify the timeline. You pull phone records if you can. You check bank activity. You canvass neighbors. You request footage before it overwrites. You check hospitals and shelters. You search the routes they would normally take and the routes they might take if they wanted to avoid being seen. You look at relationships carefully, because relationships are where motives grow. But you do not assume. You just check. You look at vehicles, because vehicles are portable rooms where crimes happen quietly. You look at water, because water keeps secrets efficiently. You look at remote areas, because isolation is opportunity. And you keep logging tips even when they are nonsense, because the one real tip often arrives wearing the clothes of 10 fake ones. That is how it goes. That is how it has always gone. And while you are doing all that, you remember the question you started with: control. In disappearances, control is who gets to decide what the first narrative is. Voluntary, involuntary, runaway, foul play. The first narrative shapes the first response. The first response shapes the first 48 hours. The first 48 hours shape the rest of the case, which is why, when you think back to Somerton Beach, you feel that small, bitter sting again. A witness saw a man who looked unwell and decided he was just sleeping. The narrative became drunk man resting, no urgency, no call. Time passed, it might not have changed the outcome. He may already have been beyond help, but it is the same mechanism. The first story people tell themselves determines what they do next. And you can feel how the night wants to carry you forward from here, deeper into the idea of stories people tell and stories people avoid,